Awesome. Okay, so today we'll be talking about scopes. And scope is something that you've all done, looked at, been a part of, did, and really kind of sets the foundation for everything going forward as well. The reason why scope is super important is because scope in ES5, which you guys are doing right now, it helps you define kind of where one set of variables exist and stop existing. But as programming gets more and more advanced, actually the concept of scopes becomes even more important because when you talk about things like privacy or like how do I make sure that certain things can only be accessible by one part of the code and not the other, that's where scope really comes in handy. So when I say scope, what do I mean? Turn off the slides really quick. All right, cool. All right. So scope basically creates kind of this. Think of it as like an area and all the variables defined in that area, right? And so when I say like let's create a variable in this scope, usually what it means is look for the nearest curly braces. The nearest curly braces are linked to a function, and we call that a functional scope. But basically, everything defined between those curly braces can be read, can be seen, can be modified by everything else in between those curly braces. So it's almost like those curly braces are kind of creating this sandbox, and everything that's created within it, everything that's used within it, can be used and modified, but they can't see things outside of it, or rather, things outside of it can't see into it. So it's almost kind of like this private area where you create all these variables, and you know that as soon as you leave this function or you leave this area, those things are no longer available. So we'll go through a few examples of what that means. So far in JavaScript, I think var has been kind of the de facto way that you guys have used to create variables. I think earlier last week I hinted that in ES6 and also in other versions of JavaScript, there are other variables that lets you create variables in a more limited scope, and we'll touch on that as it comes along. But for now, just know that when you're inside of a function, whatever that scope is, var actually lets you create a variable that's accessible to everything inside of that function scope. Okay, and basically, whenever you create, for now at least, just think of it this way: you can only create a new scope, so you can kind of only create this sandbox whenever you declare a new function, right? When else do we usually see curly braces besides declaring functions? Right, loops, conditionals, like so. There are a few other scenarios in which we can also define scopes for things like if statements, right, or while loops or whatever it is. Those curly braces are usually what we call block scopes, and so that's if you think about it that way, that's like another way to think about a scope. But for now, especially in ES5, we're just going to go with the idea that when we say a scope, we're usually referring to the nearest function scope. Cool. So let's go through some examples of what scope is and how it can be a little bit tricky sometimes to figure out where scope kind of starts and ends and where we can and cannot have access to it. So in this case here, we have this function, right? And the next 4 or 5 slides are going to be very similar in format. All we're going to be playing around with is trying to figure out where we put the num relative to the function, and to get you guys maybe a little bit more experience around kind of what we mean when we say scope and where it is or is not. Okay, so in this case, we have a function called add5, right? And notice these curly braces here. That's the scope for this function, right? And in it, we declare this variable called num, and we set it to 5. We pass in an n, and we say, all right, return n plus num. So here, when I try to console log out add 5, and I pass in 3 as a number, what should I be getting? It's not a true question. 8. Yeah, it's 8, right? Because here in this function here, what we're doing is we're saying, all right, let's create this new variable, right, called 5, and we're going to add it to another number, 3, and we're going to return it, and then I'm going to log that out. So in this case, when I log this out, I'm going to get 8, right? This makes sense, right? This does not make sense to anyone? Sorry, I should not be making that assumption. Okay, cool. So now we have this other setup where we're saying, okay, outside of this function add 5, we have this num, and it equals 5, right? And same thing as before, except now we get to take in 2 parameters. We get to take in an n and a num. And we say, okay, add 5, we pass in 3 and num. What is going to be the output here? once we execute line 15? Okay, why?
You could see the function can see outside, so it's good.
Because you set the variable at the same level you passed in that number parameter at the bottom.
Right. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. It is. And so you guys are all right in that this does log out 8. But something that we'll cover tomorrow, which is a very tricky concept, is something called pass by reference and pass by value. But I would argue in this case that the num that's here right now in line 12, this is actually based on what we pass in here, right? So what that means is that this num here in line 12 is actually different than this num out here in line 9. The only reason why they're the same is because here I pass in this num, right? And then this, I pass in the 5 into the function, and so our function knows that this is 5. I could call this variable up here anything I want. I could literally call it any other variable name I want, and this was still, and assuming I still set to 5, and here I'm still passing in 3 and this new variable here, this is still going to be n plus num, and the answer is still going to be 8. So notice how in this function here, I don't need to look for any other variables outside of my scope, right? I have access to this, but right now, because this is called num, what I'm doing is I'm actually creating my own variable called num inside this scope, and I'm setting it equal to whatever was passed in my whatever was passed to me. So these two nums, right? Sorry, these two nums here, they just happen to be named the same thing, but they're not related at all.
And how does it take that to distribute that?
Right. So here, so let's say I'm like the JavaScript compiler, right? I go through this code, and at first I say, okay, I have this variable called num, and I set it equal to 5. Okay, I have this function. This is what it does. I'm not going to do anything with it just yet, right? I come down to line 15, and now I say, okay, great. This person wants me to call this function add 5 and pass in 2 things. What am I passing in? I'm passing in the number 3, and I'm passing in this variable num, which is 5. Right? And so now when I'm trying to execute this, I jump into line 11 and subsequently line 12, and I say, okay, let's return n plus num. Well, what's n? Well, n is defined based on what I just got passed in. Similarly, num is defined by what I just got passed in. So really, everything we do inside of add 5 is based purely on what was passed in, not by any global variables on this page, right? The link between this num and this num doesn't exist. It just happens to be the same thing because we pass it in here, right? Here, if we have passed in num plus 1, what will our log be? 9, right? Because then num is going to become what? 6, right? It's going to be num. Sorry, here if it has in num plus 1 rather than 3, in add 5, the n is still going to be 3, but now the num is going to be 6, and so we're going to log out 9. Yes.
Yeah, so in the console log, it could be 3 comma val instead for value, and if your variable up top was called val, instead it would just look at the console log and say there's a 3, and then there's a variable called val in our global scope val equals 5, so just put 5 in.
Yep.
The function.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go through a few examples here, and we can just kind of play around with this a little bit more, just so you guys can get really comfortable around this concept here. And actually, once you start programming, this is actually a very common kind of interview setup, is people try to gauge how well you understand what scope is, and who has access to what variables at a given time, right? So here, let's just duplicate this right now. I think here we had we have var num equals 5 here, right? And then we have a function here. We call it add. Well, I'll just call it add num. I forgot what it was called earlier, right? I think the terms were n num, and here we're setting this up. And at some point, we go back down here and we console log out add num, and we pass in I think 3 and then num, right? And here we return n plus num, I believe. So here I log out 8, right? So this is exactly what we just had earlier, right? Everyone? Okay, cool. So what I'm saying now is I change this to a 6 now. I log this out now. I get 9, right? Once again, I'm passing in num. But what if I don't call this num, right? What if I call this val, as someone else mentioned earlier, and I pass in val here? What am I going to log out now? Right, it's still going to be 9, right? I can call this variable anything I want because this variable here is, in the first example, it just happened to be named the same thing as this, right? And the other tricky thing that JavaScript does that you don't actually see here is, wow, that's really poor placement. It's right on the paper, isn't it? I'll move this down a few lines. So, or I can zoom out maybe a little bit. No. Okay, cool. So here, like, what this is actually doing, that's a little bit like behind the scenes, and so you won't never see this declared this way, but inside of this function scope, right? So we come back to scope here. What we're actually doing is we're actually defining another variable called n, and we're setting it equal to this thing right here, this n value, right? And similarly, right beneath it, what we're also doing is we're declaring this variable called num, and we're setting it equal to the num value, right? So these two things are actually happening behind the scenes whenever we instantiate a new, when we call this function with these two values. And so you'll notice the really interesting thing is that if this happened to be called num as well, like it was in the slide, what we'll actually do is we're actually going to override this num with our num, right? And when I say our num, I mean the num that's in this scope, in the scope of this function. Okay, so we did so going back to the slide really quick now. What had happened was we did have this thing called num that happened to do what we wanted to do, but really that num was existing all the way out here, right? When we came inside of here, what this num actually is it's almost like we defined num again. We say var num inside of here is going to be equal to whatever was passed in. And we'll see a few examples in later slides of how trying to figure out which num we're talking or which variable we're talking about, whether it be the nearest function scope or on a higher level scope, matters quite a bit. Okay, so sorry, this is what we just had earlier. Okay, cool. So here we have two functions in a row, right? One's called create num, where we just create this variable num and we set it equal to 5. Here we have add 5, where we pass in a number n, right? And in line 35, we're doing the same thing we did before. We say, all right, add 5. Let's pass in 3 here. What was this output? Someone said undefined. Is it 8? Anyone else?
Oh wait, no, that's in the other function.
Undefined.
It would just give you back 3.
It give you back 3. Okay, cool. Cool. And the answer is reference error. Okay, and so 2 levels of clarity here, right? One is why did not this? So the 2 questions I'm going to pose are: one is why did this not give back any number as a result? And 2, why is it a reference error as opposed to undefined, which in JavaScript are actually different things.
Oh, because num isn't set already. It's a variable. There's no
Right. So looking at this, right, 2 things are actually breaking what we wanted, are breaking what we think we want this to do, right? One is we say, okay, let's run something called create num, right? And let's create this variable called num, and we set it equal to 5. We define this function, but nowhere on this page are we ever running it, right? Like we can write anything in line 28, but it's not going to matter because we never execute this function. So even within the context of this function here, num never gets created, right? It is purely something we just write and we ignore and we never touch. However, let's say we did run create num and we instantiate var num equals 5. Then would this work? So basically on line 34, if I say create num first, and then I say console log out add 5 3, what would that give us then?
Still wouldn't work because that num is private to that function at the top.
Right. So in line 28, when I say this var num equals 5, I'm creating this variable num. What's the scope of that variable?
Functional.
Between which lines to which lines?
27 to 29.
Right, between 27 and 20. This num can only be used by people inside of here, right? Unless I return this value somehow, unless I export it somewhere else, nothing else can see inside of this function and pick out what num is, right? So this num is private to this function, or rather, I guess the other way to think about it is like this num only exists in the scope of this create num function, right? So when we try to call this, what we're saying is, okay, great, I pass in a 3 plus num. Well, what's the value of num in this scope right here, in this add 5 scope? Right, it's not defined. Basically, nowhere did we ever say what num was, and when we try to add it, we're going to get an error. So that brings me to my second question. Why is this a reference error and not an undefined?
Not a reference where the num is.
Sorry, say what time back?
Cannot reference where the num is.
It cannot reference where the num is.
Because num doesn't exist in there, so it can't
Right.
find it.
This is an issue of scope, right? It's the reference errors are refer to errors in scope versus the other type, which are reference or types, different types of that.
So who can tell me what the difference is between reference error and undefined? Or rather, how are those two different? When would I get one and not the other? Yes.
If you just had outside of the on like line 30, if you had var num semicolon, then it would say undefined because the value of num would be undefined.
Right.
But since you never declared a variable num in the global scope, num is not.
So reference error is a variable that doesn't exist or missing there.
Right. So when I say something like var x equals 2, right? There are two things that are happening here. One is a declaration, and 2 is an assignment, right? So when I say var x equals 2, what JavaScript actually sees there is saying, okay, great. First, let me create a variable x, and then let me assign a value of 2 to that variable. Okay. So reference error means we never declared variable x. Undefined means we never assigned it a value. So that's the difference, right? So in this case, we never declared var num, right? So to your example, if in line 30 we declared var num, then num would exist. We would have this variable. It's been declared already. But when we try to add it to anything, it will say, well, there's no value here. So that's why we would get undefined. So here, when we say we got a reference error, the reason why is because num, assuming we had ran create num, to us, num is still going to be undefined, or is it going to be or is it going to be undeclared or undefined? Assuming we had executed this create num function in line 34.
It's still a reference error. It's still not declared. It doesn't exist.
Okay, so we have one vote for reference error. Anyone else?
The computer's gonna restart.
The computer's going to explode, and then you're going to buy a
No,
new
no, no,
MacBook.
your computer's gonna restart. It's upper right.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate it. Good catch. Oh, sorry. Sorry. The question is, let's say in line 34, right? I had ran create num, right? I run this function, and I declare this num variable inside the scope here. Then when I try to run this add 5 function, is this going to throw a reference error, or is it going to throw it undefined?
Still reference.
Right, it would still be a reference error because we've only defined this variable num inside the scope of this lines 27 through 29. As far as lines 31 and 33, line 31 to 33 is concerned, there is still no variable called num that's been neither declared or obviously assigned. Is this making sense to everyone? Why that sequence of events happened? Cool. Okay. Okay. So paper is unideal. So create num, we declare as num, we invoke that function, and we try to get access to this variable called num outside of this function. Doesn't exist, right? Num only exists in this function scope between lines 41 and 43. I try to access on line 46, it doesn't matter, right? And this is going to throw a reference error, although I don't really like how they wrote that. It should be num is not declared. I think is a more appropriate way is a more appropriate terminology. Okay, so the one on the left is not going to work, right? Very similar to what we did before. Here, we say it looks very similar, except rather than declare this number equal this variable called number equals 5, we're just going to return a number. right? And we're gonna set num outside of it. We're gonna say, hey, set this variable called num equal to what is returned from create num, which is 5. And so essentially this boils down to var num equals 5. And when we try to do console log it here, it works. Okay, so my question now is, which scope is this? Is this num in line 53? What scope is that in?
Same level as console.log.
Yes, and yes, I want the global, right? Right, global. Cool. So we'll come back to the global scope in just a little bit of what that exactly means. But just to kind of close off this part, so the brackets around these functions, I think that so the analogy they use here is a one-way glass, right? Which means that anything inside of that function scope can see anything else inside that function scope. And if you're inside of it, you can also see things in the scope outside of it, but other people can't see it, right? So if I see var declared in line 5, I try to access this this num2 variable declared in line 5. If I try to access that anywhere else outside of lines 4 through 7, I'm gonna get an error because to the rest of this function, it doesn't exist. It's like a black box, right? However, inside of here, when I try to console log out this out, well, I can see this. I can see whatever's outside of it, right? Just like if I declared another function between lines 4 and 7, and I create another variable inside there, it can see what num2 is, but num2 can't see, or this outside function can't see what's inside of it. So in this way, you can actually nest these functions infinite times, and through each nesting, you kind of create these mini black boxes that you can use to hold private information. So the global scope comes into play, right? So the global scope and the window, at least to me, I use them fairly synonymously. But your browser, right, or wherever you're editing your code in, that also has a global scope, which is just like this document, right? Anything you write in here, that is like the parent scope at the very top. If you actually see how JavaScript compiles, JavaScript actually, once you like submit a code to be compiled, it actually does put like essentially curly braces around your entire block of code. So at some point down the road, it does create this artificial block for you. This artificial scope for you, but you just don't see it. But whenever you look at a piece of JavaScript on a piece of paper or IDE or whatever it is, assume that the global scope does exist. The most important thing to take away from the global scope, right, is not what to do, but what not to do. And what you don't want to do is ever do something like this, where you declare a variable where you assign a variable without declaring it. Because by default, what that means is, hey, take this variable and put it on my global scope, and then assign it that value. Can anyone just take a few guesses as to why this is really bad behavior? And in case you can't read the title, we really, really, really encourage you to never, ever do this.
You could change the value for that variable in another function that you don't want to change, or something that happens to use it.
Right. That's definitely one possibility. Anything else?
Conflict might the same thing could be defined something else somewhere.
Right. Like I think it might override something that's already been declared or already been assigned somewhere else, right? So we definitely have that concern. What else?
Is there more overhead to local variables?
There might be, but I wouldn't say it's like the reason why we try to shy away from using it, right?
Wouldn't it be difficult to identify what that variable was down the line? Because if you were to look at the code, you would see the original declaration of the variable as one thing, and then you would have to know that it was changed in a function somewhere else in the code in order to find out what it actually was.
Right, yeah. So I think this is I think all three are saying something very similar. Like if you use a global variable here, it's really hard to figure out if anyone else is using that same variable name for something else, or if they have used for something else what the original value was and whether or not this is going to overwrite it, right? So at the very base level, just to kind of save save headaches down the road, you always want to make sure that you're declaring everything in the right place. And this is exactly the first reason why you guys are mentioning, right? So here on the left-hand side, we'll cover what this syntax means in a little bit, but for now, just assume that means that we declare this function and we run it in the same go. Okay. So here we declare this variable called mayor, right? And we assign it the value Bloomberg, and we do it in line 1, right? We then invoke this function here, and we call it we call it de Blasio, right? And so this is a little bit tricky to understand. Have you guys come across in your own JavaScript studies what the concept of hoisting means?
Going up to the top of the program.
I'm sorry?
Or there's something up to the top of the program, like outside of the function or whatever scope it's in.
Right. So hoisting, yeah. So hoisting essentially is just say that. So if you think about how a computer or a compiler reads JavaScript, right? Like as humans, usually we read it from top down, right? And we say, all right, let's do this in line 1, you know. And if we use a variable in line, well, maybe not line 1, but if we use a variable in line 10, conceptually speaking, we expect it to be defined somewhere before then, right? We define this variable and then we use it. The way that computers look at hoisting, and hoisting is something we're going to cover in a little bit, but the way that computers look at hoisting actually is a little bit different, right? In that different things get hoisted in different order, right? So when a compiler reads through your JavaScript, it's going to go through, and the first thing that it's going to create, so to speak, in your code, are actually all the functions first. Okay, so if I have so in this case, So in this case, what is actually going to happen is I'm going to go through this, right? And I'm going to try to execute these codes first, right? This is going to execute before this. Because when I go through this is called an immediately invoking function. And what that means is I have this function here that defines this global variable called de Blasio, or called mayor, and I assign the value of de Blasio, and I log it out right away. So when this is actually running in the very beginning, this line 1 var mayor hasn't even been declared yet, right? So this local version of mayor doesn't exist, right? So I go through this, and then I go through line 1 here, right? But now when I try to look at it through here now, contrast it with the right-hand side. Now, rather than creating this major global variable called mayor, I'm actually going to also create this variable called mayor, but this is only going to override. This is really going to override what the existing value mayor was, but the overridden value only exists within lines 3 to 6 in this function scope. So in this function, when I try to console log out mayor, I get de Blasio because I just overrode it here. But anywhere else I try to console log out what mayor is, it's actually going to be the original value still. Right. So the main thing to take away from this slide is just that when you create a global variable, when you put something in the global scope, it overrides it for everyone across the board, right? And very rarely do you ever want to do something like that. Well, in 99% of cases, and I think some compilers actually are now starting to throw errors whenever you do start using global variables, because it is like such a bad practice and an anti-pattern that a lot of developing frameworks are actively discouraging you from using global variables as much as possible. But so in 99% of use cases, what you really want to do is define a function, define the variable that you want, use that variable, and then reserve it only within the confines of your function, but then allow someone else to redefine that same function somewhere else, or to redefine that same variable somewhere else.
So on that, one's global, one's not, but I'm trying to figure out why the left one's global and the other one's not. They look the same.
Well, this one has no var.
Oh.
Right. The only thing that's different between these two lines is line 4 that forgets this var, right? Because var puts this variable in your nearest function scope. Yes.
So this applies to any case, whether it's an immediately invoked function or not, with the brackets around the function like you have, right? So like if these examples didn't have the parent brackets
Mhm.
around them, this still
When you say brackets, you mean the curly braces or the
those
parentheses?
brackets outside of the function. You're talking about that's called an immediately invoked function.
Right, and I'll talk a little bit about why like this syntax looks the way it does. It has to do with the way the JavaScript recompiles it. But effectively, what this is doing is this is going to go through. It's going to see this function. It's going to hoist it first and then run it right away.
Right, but if that wasn't the case, if those brackets weren't there, it just looked like regular function that we've been using, would this still apply where it would be hoisted or it would be processed first and that
Well,
bear would become global to everything?
well, we would never run it then.
Wasted but not run it.
Right. So someone else. So hoisting just means like, does this thing exist? Ironically, on a global scope, right? Like hoisting just means can someone else use this, right? So this thing, this extra curly braces here, that's how we call functions normally, right? Like when we execute function, we write the name of the function, then we put parentheses around it, and we pass in any arguments when we need to, right? This is just executing this function. If these parentheses are gone, then we go through this. This is never going to execute because this function never gets executed.
But it'll be defined first.
It will be defined, yes, it will be defined. Someone else, like on line 7 or on line 2 for that matter, if you ever want to call, well, this is we would call it an anonymous function because there's no name here. But if this function had a name and we want to call it, they could call it right away, right? But right now, the important thing to know here is just that this is written explicitly for the purpose that we want to run this before anything else happens.
So say that function is not immediately invoking,
Mhm.
and the page loads, and then you call that with the mayor variable without the var keyword in front of it. Does it then get hoisted after you call that function?
Great question. Okay, so let me just make sure I have this. It's a shame that this is, yeah, it's an image. Okay, cool. All right, so let's just write this out. Okay, so we had mayor and we had, I think, Bloomberg, right? And then down the road we had this immediately invoking function. Pet, we take in no arguments. We're gonna execute it, and then I think down here we also console logged out mayor, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. And here I think we had mayor equals de Blasio. Okay, cool. And then we're gonna console log, and I'll just write mayor here so we can differentiate between these two mayors. I'll say f mayor to know that this is a mayor inside the function, and then I'll call the other one something else too. And then here, this will be call it G mayor to differentiate as a global scope mayor. Cool. Okay. So, or actually, let me put the var back in here. So this is kind of what we're normally used to seeing, right? We go through this. As we go through this line of code, right? Remember, functions get hoisted first, right? When a JavaScript compiler reads this code, the functions take precedence over the variable assignments, right? So as I go through this, I see a function, I as in the JavaScript compiler, it sees a function and it sees, oh, it's an immediately invoking function. So really, this is the first thing that it really reads and starts executing, right? I read it, I define this variable, this variable that's on the global scope for sure, right? But it is local to this function scope, right? Right, it's global to this local type. This variable called mayor that's in this function scope here, I call it de Blasio, and I log it out, f mayor. That is why f mayor logs out first, right? Is because from a JavaScript priority perspective, this function takes precedence over everything else, right? So we run through line 3, line 4, line 5, and line 6 first. And then JavaScript says, okay, great, I've handled the functions, which are the highest priority items. What's next? Next is let's take a look at at line 1, which we're also declaring this variable called mayor. Oh, okay, cool. So now this is going to override whatever mayor is, right? And that's why when we log out gmayor, we get Bloomberg. Is because we go through line 3, 4, 5, 6, then we do line 1, then we do line 8. That's the order in which this is going to get executed.
final value of mayor is Bloomberg.
The value of mayor at line 8 is going to be Bloomberg, yes. Right.
So then if I use it later on somewhere else, it's still going to be Bloomberg.
Sure.
Until
So
someone changes it.
right. So what you're saying is here is here. Let's say I have another function here, right? Okay, cool. And I pass in something, whatever, doesn't matter. And I'm just console logging out mayor. And then, oh god. And then you're saying is I invoke it here, right? So this, in this case, I'll call this h mayor. Cool. Oh god. Okay, you guys get the idea. Spacing something. Okay. So here, what was happening was everything was happening before, right? And then I have this other function. And it says log mayor. So when I call the mayor, when I call this function foo on line 13, it says, okay, great. Let's figure out what the latest version of mayor is. Oh, it's Bloomberg. So let's log that out. Right? Now, if I wanted to go back on this a little bit differently, let's say I tried hoisting this. I tried invoking it right away. Why does foo not exist? Oh, haha. It's because I. Okay. Cool. Cool. Is this what I'm looking to do? Why is so? Okay, so now this is telling me that.
Should still be. Oh wait, no, De Blasio is.
Did I change it earlier?
De Blasio is private. Yeah, you made it there.
Oh, right. Yeah, you're right because here I manually changed it to De Blasio in the correct scope here. So yeah, so in this case, De Blasio is only mayor to this function right here. Okay. Cool. So that. Okay, cool. So yeah, so just to belabor the point one more time, right? Don't use global variables because one, it'll overwrite something. And then here we're talking about hoisting, right? So this is basically says kind of, what we've talked about, right? Which is that the JavaScript, when it goes over your code, it does it 2 times, right? And in this case, I guess we're talking primarily about variables here, right? But essentially, when we do this, what it does first is, so let's take a look at, so this line is very simple, right? If this was my entire code, I just try to log out something called x, and it doesn't exist, much like how in the first example we were doing with num, it's going to give us a reference error, right? Because we never declared x. So it's saying, I don't even know where to start looking for this possible value, and I'm going to throw back a reference error. In this case here, in line console, on the right-hand side, what we're doing is we're logging x, but we're declaring x at a later time. Right? And so when JavaScript passes through this code, the first thing that it's going to do is that it's going to actually go through and declare x first. It's going to say var x exists, right? It's something that I'm going to recognize. And then it's going to try to execute all the other code, right? It's going to say, all right, console log out for me x. Well, var x has a reference. It just has no value. So when I log it out, I'm not going to get any, there's no number assigned to it. So I'm going to throw back an undefined. And then after I throw back the undefined, I then go through and assign the variable value of x. I remember a question, I think it was you guys had a while back, which was like, basically when I create a function, right? Why does it matter to do function foo, pass in parameters, and then set the scope like we were doing earlier on the previous. So basically, imagine this without the parentheses. What's the difference between doing this versus doing, var x equals this?
That runs it right away, and then the var x equals just assigns it?
It doesn't run it right away. The running here is done by the parentheses, which is invoking the function. So what I'm talking about is coming back to this code example really quick here too, right? So it's like saying what's the difference between something like foo, right? I do this, and then I console.log out something. What's the difference between that versus something like this? Var foo equals function like this, right? So really, for all intents and purpose, this is gonna do the same These two functions are going to do, this does very similar things in terms of creating a function that then someone else can reference. So in both cases, I can call foo parentheses and it's going to work. But the reason why there is a difference here is due to hoisting, right? Is due to the order in which JavaScript processes it. When you do it like this gets added to the scope right away on the first pass. This is creating a variable this is creating a variable called foo on the first pass, and then on the second pass is when it assigns it the value of that function. So that's a slight caveat in difference between declaring a function like this versus like this. Okay. Yes.
So the bar foo gets hoisted, and then the function is below it, and then it's declared, and then it runs. Is that what's happening?
So runs is a very like sensitive word here because in this function right here, nothing's being run, right? Like we're just all about declaring and assigning for now.
It's assigned, not run, but it's assigned.
Right.
After first the declaration foo is hoisted. This is for the second one.
Yep.
And then the function is after.
Yep. So let's do this here.
It's assigned later.
So here, right? So let me do this one. Okay, so here, right? I have two functions, who and foo. Okay, who is going to print out for me an exclamation point, and then foo is going to print out for me a question mark, right? And I run both after. So you're right. I should definitely switch these two. Hold up.
Oh, and it's gonna run the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, that's going to do it in sequential order here. Let's see. Okay, so when I run this, right, you'll notice who runs perfectly fine, right? Why? Because when the JavaScript compiler reads through this, says, okay, which things on this page are the most important? This thing is, right? This is a function declared, I'm gonna hoist this to the very top first, and that's my first pass. Okay, on my second pass, okay, run who, great, I'll run who, I'll log out my exclamation point. Run foo, well, foo doesn't exist. It should be a reference error or yeah, but this is basically a reference error, essentially saying I can't run this, right? However, if I had put foo, if I try to run foo again down here, actually I can't leave it in there. So if I run this, now it will run the way that we want it to, right? Because this is only being run after the second pass in which JavaScript goes and declares, assigns as an actual value of the function. Good. Cool.
So you would really only use var foo if you didn't want it to run the first if you didn't want it to be hoisted and run first.
Yes. Yeah. So
why would you not want it to be hoisted? Why would you want a function not want to be hoisted? Does it depend on the program you're making?
Well, so there are a few use cases in which you actually want the variable there. Like you want to be able to have the flexibility of a variable and pass it back and forth between certain things, right? Like for you guys, I would think in most of the code that you write, you could probably get away with either thing. But the concept of declaring it this way versus the other way, like quite honestly, like in the vast majority of cases, it won't matter, to be honest. If you just want priority, you can always declare it this way. I have seen people declare like the way you do with a var because it is much easier to pass around later on in the code. Especially if you're trying to assign it, like if you're trying to create like an object, right, and you're trying to say, hey, throw this value in there, it's really hard to do it, with the way declaring line 4 versus line 8 because you have an actual variable you can package up and pass to other places.
And you can put it in a function.
I can put in a function.
You can put a function in a function.
Sure, totally, yeah. But like when you declare a function going forward, like in general, like you could get away with either way of doing it. But I think like the whole concept behind hoisting is it's important to know that like kind of what's available to you at what point in your code. Because a lot of times when we read code as humans, like it makes sense to read it top down, left to right, right? And that's not the way that JavaScript actually goes through your code. Like there is a priority level of kind of what data types come before others. Cool. All right, cool. So just a few more slides here, and then we can talk about the workshop. And yes.
I just want to get the order correct. So basically, it's declaration without assignment first, and then function, and then console.log, and then assignment. Is it right? Basically, declaration goes up first, run second, and then console.log, and then after that we will assign the value back to the variable. Is it right, this order?
I think the function goes first.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell me what to write, and I will write it in the order that you say, and then we'll see if it runs. That would be the fastest way to check. And by the way, this is like this is by far like the best way I know of figuring out JavaScript is just to find like an IDE that you trust and just run it. And like it'll very quickly become clear through trial and error kind of what's going on. So when I do this, it's not because like it's not necessarily because like oh like I'm just too lazy to tell you. It's like this is like by far the best way for you to troubleshoot code. When I do a lot of at my current job, like when I interview someone else, actually one of the main things that like as a team we actually try to look out for is everyone's going to write really bad code at some point in their life. You're going to write code that's going to break or not work right. One of the things we do, take a pretty heavy emphasis on is how well can they troubleshoot this code, right? Like if something isn't working right, how fast do they say, okay, let me put some logs here, or let me test this part out, or let me try to figure out like what it's doing and where the breakage points are, right? So as like just like a note, like never be afraid to just open up a random console, whether it be in Chrome or in an IDE, and just start running code like left and right, because that's always the fastest way to make sure like you understand something that's going to happen. Sorry, that was a quick sidebar, but go ahead. What should I be writing here?
I'm not sure. I
Okay.
just want to know like whether declaration first or function runs first.
Okay, cool. So you're saying is, so let's just say I have a var x equals 2, right? And you're saying if I have a function foo that's gonna console.log out x, and you want to immediately invoke this. Is that what you're asking?
Actually, what I'm asking is that is declaration runs first or function runs first? Because I know assignment is going to run after function.
Assignment is going to run after function.
I think why he's asking is what the
Where's the how
in
the
the
order?
first pass it functions and declarations, and then the second pass is the assignments. He wants to know the order that JavaScript.
Oh, I see.
Precedence order, is that what you're talking about?
Well, I think it's what you have written there, but without the exactly. So you have that what you had originally, and then you have another function that doesn't have that. So which exactly.
Okay, and so I'll say this is like no brace, no, and then this is like this, you mean? I never called foo. That would do it. So where do you guys want me to call foo? Anywhere? Like here? Cool.
Can you try it on line 10?
Can we try running this on line 10?
Yeah.
Sure.
Line 10.
I thought that takes precedence, the parentheses foo function or the foo function. When you declare, even if you declare foo on top of the parentheses function, the immediately calling function.
Sorry, so here like what's okay, so sorry, this is like it's coding is like, it's sometimes hard to talk about because it's too many words that sound the same thing. So here where we're going through this, right, is the first thing we do is we're gonna say, okay, I'm gonna hoist up this function. Well, they're both called foo, which is really bad. I'll call this one something else, right? I'll call it who. Okay, so just okay, quote, we're running it in the same way, right? So here what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna have this function, right? I go through this, right? I hoist up, I hoist this up, and actually, hold up, I do this wrong.
Yeah. So why is
Why? So why line A? Why is that x? Why is that x returning 2?
So your third x is 2.
Right. Right, but I think like the question is like, so when I go through this, right, this is gonna get hoisted first, and this should run first. So theoretically, when I get here, x has not been x has not been defined yet. So why do I get 2 here? And this is
Is it because like
Hmm?
even though that immediately invoking function, the who, gets set in the first pass, that it doesn't get run till after the second pass, which is when x is already assigned. So it doesn't actually get run until. Is that possible? No. It's a guess.
that is possible, although I'm quite surprised by this.
More-
Because in the de
Shouldn't-
Blasio.
My question was, shouldn't who run first and then foo? If you declare foo on line 4, even then shouldn't who run first because of the immediate parentheses? If you declare foo on 4, line 2, sorry,
Right.
then shouldn't who run first even then because you have those immediately executing brackets?
No, because who is still running before foo. Just because it goes through the first pass, I don't think. That's why I'm thinking it doesn't run in the first pass.
No, who
even though
doesn't
it
run
gets-
first? I think who runs first.
Yeah.
Sorry. Who is
Right.
IFE?
Yeah, but if you have foo on line 2, if
But
you
foo isn't called until line
Okay.
11.
yeah, but if you had it there.
Okay, so looking at this code, right? When we go through, so let's set aside the x part for now, right? I go through this, right? I hoist foo. Okay? I go through, so I start really on line 3, right? I do whatever I gotta do in line 3 here. I then get down to line 7, and I say, okay, great. Now I'm a hoist who. Okay? So now both foo and who are on my global scope. Does that make sense too?
Sure.
I mean, you shook your head, so if it doesn't, like, let me know.
No, I got it. Doesn't matter.
Okay, so I mean, I start, I do still do top down, right? I just skip over certain things that aren't like a priority as a JavaScript compiler, right? So I go to foo first, I hoist that up. I go to who now, right? I hoist that up, and I say, oh, okay, cool. This is telling me to execute who right away, right? And then it's gonna go down to here and says, okay, now I'm also gonna execute foo as well. Earlier when we had foo up here, now you'll see that this order is different, right?
This was my question. Since you have those immediately executing parentheses, shouldn't who execute first and then go to foo?
No, because we're going through and we're hoisting up the functions first, and then we look at the order in which functions are being called, right? Foo is happening, and then we're doing whatever we do it down foo here, right? So gotcha. Okay, so sorry, it took me a while to understand like that question. Okay, cool. Yeah. So basically, when we have functions and we hoist them up, the hoisting always comes first, right? As a JavaScript compiler, what JavaScript is going to do is it's going to hoist everything it could possibly need to hoist before it runs anything, right? Because it needs to make sure that, hey, because it's very possible that one of these may require something else on the page later on the page that should be hoisted with the same priority. Yes.
So it hoists both the functions up and then it goes back down again. And
Right.
Then it will
Yeah, JavaScript essentially is going to read this over and over. Like it's going to not over and over and over again indefinite, but like there is a priority which it goes through it does this, it goes through it and it does this,
Steal the function.
right? And so
When does it read the variable x? It's like a triage where it hoists the functions and then it declares the variable.
well, so this is a part that actually I will look into during the break because this is actually really weird, and I wonder if this is the way that REPL's implemented a little differently. Because when we hoist this up, right, like when we do like var, like I understand why this is so these two are being hoisted, and then x is being declared and assigned. I guess what I want to make sure before I tell you guys anything definite, right, is whether or not this declaration happens before we start running it. So there's absolutely no doubt that foo and who are going to be hoisted before the variable does. I'm just what I'm trying to figure out right now is why is this 2 as opposed to undefined, which is what I thought it would be. Yes.
When I was going through this, like and just looking at like variable definitions, like,
Yeah.
For some reason in REPL, and I don't know if you said this or not, but if you do like just without saying var and just do like x equals 2,
Mhm.
and then do immediately after var x equals 2 or var x equals 3, then when you console log x, it'll be 3.
Right, because you're creating a global variable called x, and then you redefine it.
And so when you set var equals x, that's also considered a global variable outside of any function.
Well, so when I do this, right, like this tosses this up on the window.
Okay.
Right? This also happens to toss it up on the window because this happens to be in the same scope.
Okay.
Right? I could also do line 2 inside one of these functions, but then it will confine this variable x only to this function.
So the global space is anything that's not within a function in your document.
Right. It's like right.
Global.
Imagine looking at your document and then you put in a set of curly braces before the first character and after the last character, and that's your quote unquote global scope.
Okay.
Right. So if I declare var x equals 3 in line 5, it's going to redefine x only in this function here. If I say x, assuming this didn't exist, right? If I say x equals 2 here, it will change the value of x for everyone else on the page.
So it's not necessarily like the x equals 2 is going to take precedence over var x equals 3 just because you don't set a variable in front. It's kind of the same definition. You shouldn't use it, but it's kind of the same definition. Is the way we should look at it.
Well, it's going to matter in which the order in which you call them. Right. So cool. Okay. So let me. So I will come back to this. I will do a little digging in it. I wonder if this is the way REPL implements this. But let's just say I have something like this, right? So I have two functions here, right? Foo and who. Sorry, I guess we're sick of those right now. Okay. So how should I do this?
You could probably try debugging this in the Chrome thing.
Yeah, and I probably don't want to do it live. I'll probably just do it like during the break really quick. But I just want to really quick answer the question of I think I see what you're getting at, right? So let's just say I have something called var x equals 3 here. Or actually, you know what? Let's have var x equals 3 inside of here. Okay. And then I'll have x equals 2 out here. And then, so here I'll say this is foo. And then here I'll say this is who. Okay, so now when I invoke these functions here, okay. So this makes sense now, right? So this is the way that we expect to work. I think your question is, shoot. Okay, so if I go here, right, and I say I remove that, and I say x equals 4. This is going to give me 3 and 4. But your question is now if I call foo again down here, what's going to happen, right? Right. So because the foo has its own version of whatever x or whatever number I used here is, like once again, this is going to be maintained in this scope here, right? If, however, I didn't have that, let's say this line didn't exist at all, right? I don't like, well, this is, I mean, this basically creates just like the global scope here, but essentially like assuming that var somehow exists, right? Now when I change it, I'm basically changing it for everybody else, right? So like, what's another way I can visually kind of explain this a little bit? So, yeah.
I'm trying to, that's like having a hard time explaining what I'm confused about. Like if you have, I'm talking about like outside of a function in the global space.
Okay.
Right? Like so if you have x equals 3 and then immediately after you have var x equals 4. You said that, and I'm guessing this is just in functions, but you said that it's when you use the x without var and you're making a global variable, isn't it still going to have precedence over that x that you just defined afterwards, or
So
is that basically like the same like you're just redefining x like up there? Is that what that is?
right.
Okay. Okay. I mean that's all of that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry. I think where it gets a little bit trickier is like when you do it inside of another function, like just know that the global kind of breaks out of the scope,
Yeah.
which is like people really don't encourage you to use it.
It's basically when you don't use var inside of a function, you're getting into really dangerous territory. But as a general practice, you should never not use var.
You should almost always use var.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So in the example you did just before this one where who had the x equals to 4 without the var keyword, why wasn't the second foo that you called, why did that return 4? Oh, because var x got reset at 3
Right.
when it got called again.
Right.
Okay.
So as foo is concerned, like it's almost like foo says like, okay, great, I have this variable called x, and when we call it, okay, so how about this? Here's another thing about it, right? When we try to console log this out here, and this is actually what programs does, what JavaScript does, right? Is this, okay, great. Is there an x defined in my local scope? No. Is there one defined in my parent scope? No. Is there one defined in my parent's parent scope? And so on until you reach the final global scope, and that's where this x would have been, right? So one thing as you start coding more and more is you'll also start getting to the idea of object inheritance, right? And that's exactly how it works. Is that like whenever you try to execute any variable or anything really, what the code is always going to do is it's like, okay, is there anything that resembles this in my immediate scope? If not, let me check my parents. Then let me check my parents' parents, and you keep going on and on outwards until you reach the global scope. And if there's nothing there, then you say, okay, this doesn't exist, and throw back a reference error or any other kind of error, right? So as far as foo is concerned, is we start here, right? And says, okay, great. Do I have an x in here? Oh, I do. Cool. Like it never checks like the global scope. There's no need to. I already have what I need here. Cool. Yeah, and this is like it's hard to explain too, right? Because it's like it's a lot of it has to do with like the order in which you do things. And so like if you guys want to walk through any REPL examples, like that's the best way I know of how to explain this is just like put it on the computer and just watch it execute. Okay, cool. Right. Yeah, and so this is basically saying so this is basically kind of talks about how the hoisting is different for a function versus a variable, right? When you do something with a function expression, which basically means you're doing like the var thing, you basically hoist up say hi first. It's kind of like the way we declare x, right? You hoist up say hi first, and it's just like a variable. It's undefined. It exists, but it's undefined, right? And then during the second pass of it, we assign it this value function. When you do a function declaration, so when you just do it like this, like you just declare the function right away, what that does is it actually hoists the entire thing up as is for you.
Can we never use the expression and always use the declaration and still work?
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, like if you really need to, you can always just like reconfigure code to make it work in a certain way if you want it, right? Like using only one of these. Right.
But would there be circumstances where we need to use the var thing as well, or can we just like always use the declaration?
So there are, right? So one of the reasons why, so this is actually the last slide. Immediately invoking functions. IIFE stands for immediate invocation, which is like basically what we saw earlier, right? With like the two parentheses, and then we invoke it right away. The reason why that's really the reason why people do that is because a lot of times, like let's say the page loads right away, right? Like you may want a bunch of things to load on the page right away. And so let's say I log into Facebook, and I'm sure that's not how they do it because it's not even remotely close to being secure, right? But if I was to say, hey, I log on to Facebook, and the first thing Facebook does is check my username and password, right? I don't want those variables floating around in a way that anything else on the page can see what they are. Right? So in that case, one way around that is to say, okay, let's do an immediate invoking function where I have my username, my password in there. I invoke it. I do what I need to be done. And then once that function finishes being invoked, nothing else can see those variables anymore. So that's what this fourth bullet here is. When it says locked-in values, it's basically saying there are scenarios in which you want to declare a function in a way that you want to invoke it right away when the page loads. You want to do what it is and needs to be done. And then you want to say, okay, no one can touch this ever again. So that's like, so there are these like really weird edge cases in which declarative versus I forgot what the other one's called, but I think expression. Yeah, function expressions versus function declarations. So there are like small edge cases in which you will want to use one over the other. But like for the vast majority of cases, like those two are very interchangeable. I think like when you look at like the reason why we're belaboring this point is not necessarily like what you do when you write, but when you see other people's code and how they write, it's really important to keep in mind how this works, because otherwise like someone else's, you might not do this yourself, but someone else's code will make no sense to you in terms of how it's being called in the order in which things are being hoisted. Good. Okay.
So does that mean that with these immediately invoked function expressions throughout your program that you can't invoke that function again once it like within the brackets it gets hoisted?
Great question. So if we go back to this example here, right, of de Blasio, how will you call this again?
Without a name for it, you can't.
Right. So if you put like an anonymous name function in an invoke function, it will invoke, and then you won't have any reference to it anywhere else. So even if you want to call it again, you have no idea where to start.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why like this is like an efficient way for you to say, hey, do something in the very beginning, and then I'll never need you again. And in fact, I don't want you to ever be used ever again by anything else on the page. Right? When you declare something with a var x, I can go in Chrome and say, print out var x for me, and it will print it out for me. Right? I can't say print that out for me or execute that again. And so there is and so when we talk about closure and scope, so maybe let's step back and talk about the bigger question, right? Of, well, if this is so easy, like if these things are if we can make everything, basically, why not make everything available on the global scope so that everyone can see everything all at once, right? And so if you're writing a super small one-page thing, maybe it works for you, go for it. But like in production level environments for, I guess, load, but mostly for security and just for like code, code cohesion, you will very, very, very rarely ever see global variables anywhere in your code. And in fact, anything globally in programming is usually frowned upon. There are like very few cases in which you would ever want to like have a global thing, right? So one of the things at full stack they talk about is something called sockets, right? So how do I emit an event, right? And how do I like receive an event and know what to do with it? There are certain things you can do when you say, hey, broadcast this to everyone, right? Or when you're looking at the CS, or when you're looking at a Chrome, you're looking at a page node, there are things you can do where you can modify the root of the page, right? And so those are all ways to kind of do something on a global scale. And more often than not, like you can do them, but they're very, very frowned upon. I know some IDEs do throw errors or warnings at you. Most linters, I think, throw errors at you when you try to do anything global because it's just a really, really bad practice. Okay. Cool. So I will look into the to thing just so I can give you guys a really clear definition of why that to is being printed as opposed to being undefined. But outside of that, are there any other questions here or any other examples you want to go through? Yes.
Doesn't it say there that the IIFD has access to the outer functions past the arguments of variable?
Any function defined inside another function can access. So what that basically means in practice, right, is let's just say I have and actually I don't know why they put it there because it actually applies to all functions, not just IFEs. But let's say I have a function foo here, right? And I say var x equals 3, and then I have another function here, right? Foo or goo, right? And I can do this right here. If I do console.log out x, why did it not? Did I never call anything? And that would explain it. Okay, cool. And then obviously I want to. Yeah. So cool. Okay. So in this case, right, I think all this is trying to say to you that here we have a nested function inside of another function. The arguments, the parameters, whatever's in foo is also accessible to goo, right? Because foo is a parent. So goo can see out, right? But if I had something here that was like console.log out, we'll say y, right? And I say, here I do var y equals 7. this is going to throw an error, right? Is because goo can see out into foo and all the arguments that foo has. Foo cannot see into goo. I should pick better words, but yeah. So that's the concept. And so when you talk about arguments, it's also saying like something like, hey, you know, what if this was like the thing, right? So if I called 3 here, right? Goo is still going to break. Like this y is not going to work, but the inner function now has access to the inner function. This goo function here. This has access to the arguments and the parameters of the parent function, right? And it makes sense, right? If you think about like kind of how we talked about how this is how JavaScript's going to execute this to say, all right, log out x for me. Great. Do I have an x? No. Let's go out. Do my parents have an x? Oh, they do. It's here. Great. Let's console log it out, right? It's going to keep looking outer and outer until it reaches the global scope, and that doesn't have it. It's going to stop. So that's what that closure was trying to say.
Right, but then for the immediately invoked function, isn't that why it is able to read the var x equals 3 if that's the very first line? Because, like, you were wondering why it was printing out you thought it should have been undefined. Isn't it because the var x equals 3 is in the global scope above those, so the immediately invoked function can see that?
So you're saying is can the immediately invoked function? So what you're saying is then is that immediately invoked function. So when it goes through, it declares it first, and then assigns it. And you're saying is for immediately invoking functions, it will run after the global variables have already been declared and defined.
Well, depending on where the global variable was. Since
Right.
Before the parentheses.
Yeah, and that's very possible. I'm gonna actually test this out pretty thoroughly because the other thing I'm also wary of is like repo does do some things a bit differently than traditional like JavaScript does because it needs to render it in like a certain way. At least it does for Python and some other languages that aren't meant to be rendered browser side. So I will look into it and I will definitely let you know why that is. But just so you guys know, like that's what this is closure bullet is talking about. It's just the idea that like a child or a nested function, whatever, has access to the arguments and the parameters of the parent. Cool? Awesome. Okay, so great, it's 8 o'clock. All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna break out, I'll give you guys pairs, we're gonna do the workshops. And then today's workshops, I think, are actually a little bit shorter in some ways. And so starting at around 9, I'll see kind of how the class is doing. But starting around 9, we're actually just gonna go through the solutions together as a class. And one of the things I really wanna encourage is like, I'm gonna ask for volunteers, whether voluntarily or not. Actually, that's probably a bad joke to make. But I'm gonna ask people to Slack me like their solutions. So basically, I want teams to Slack me their solutions. I'll put them on the board. As a group, we'll go through them, try to figure out like if they work, why they work, and if they don't, you know, how to fix it. And so hopefully, you guys can start seeing how other groups are working through code. And the thing is also a really good practice to learn how to read other people's code because it's super hard. Like especially, like it's like the way that code is written is not how it's read. It's read very linearly top down, but when you write code, I'm sure as you all experience, like you work on one thing and then you work on something else and you go back to the first thing, you make it bigger, and so you kind of go run back and forth. And like in your mind, the code makes sense in a certain way, but to everyone else, it just looks like complete, like a jumble, like a mess. So just learning how to read other people's code is also really cool. So we're gonna do that too. So feel free to take a 5-minute break or however a few minute break, and then I'll stack out the pairs and then just get started whenever you feel ready.